When the distant sound of the bell rang, Ayumi, along with her aunt Nobuko and her 2 children, walked into the morning hall. Today is the funeral of Ayumi's mother, Misaki. Nobuko's family came all the way from the city, and Ayumi, who is of similar age to her cousin Sakura, had not seen her for a long time. They should have had endless words to share. But at this moment, Ayumi held her mother's tablet, her heart filled with sorrow. From now on, she would be all alone, with no parents to rely on. Although Nobuko and the grandmother publicly claimed that her mother passed away due to illness, the thought of her mother's true cause of death made Ayumi's grief hard to contain. Ayumi could not accept such a cruel reality, and thus had not yet mustered the courage to open the letter her mother left for her. Cousin Sakura couldn't help but worry about Ayumi's condition. Just as it happened to be summer vacation, she begged her mother Nobuko to allow her to stay in the countryside to accompany Ayumi. So Nobuko ultimately returned to their home in the city with only her son. Before leaving, Ayumi handed her an invitation, saying it was a letter that had arrived at their home not long ago, inviting her mother to attend a high school reunion next week. Nobuko accepted the invitation and told her niece Ayumi not to worry, as she would handle the matter. Nobuko and her sister Misaki had attended the same high school. Her original plan was to go to the reunion and inform everyone of her sister's death. As soon as Nobuko appeared, unexpectedly, the surrounding crowd approached her, calling her Misaki with great enthusiasm. It turned out that after several decades, the old acquaintances from her alma mater mistakenly recognized Misaki's sister Nobuko as her. In such a lively atmosphere, Nobuko was momentarily at a loss for how to explain and had to go along with it, temporarily pretending to be her sister. Just then, a figure not far away made her suddenly stop in her tracks. That person was Kyojuro, the senior she had secretly admired during high school. But now, Nobuko was a mother of 2, and any fluttering feelings had turned into mere illusions. So she dared only to glance at him a couple of times before wanting to leave. At that moment, an old recording suddenly played over the loudspeaker. It was Misaki's speech at the high school graduation ceremony many years ago. Today, students, you have finally arrived at your graduation day. This time in high school may become an unforgettable and irreplaceable memory in your lives. If someone asks about future dreams and goals, at that time, Misaki did not have a specific answer, but she believed that this need not be a regret, because the future that unfolds ahead has countless choices, hiding infinite possibilities. Many years later, some of the boys at the table will realize their dreams, while others may let go of their original aspirations. But when they encounter difficulties, feel lost, or even lose faith in life, those high school years, when dreams were just beginning to sprout and everyone shone equally, will surely become the strength that supports them to keep moving forward. Nobuko listened to her sister's speech, and the nervousness she felt from meeting her senior was instantly replaced by a wave of sorrow. In the moment her sister chose to end her life, would she remember those brilliant high school years? At that time, Misaki was such a remarkable student council president, beautiful and outstanding in her studies. Yet, as time changes, she ultimately met such a tragic end. Nobuko did not intend to linger and left first. At that moment, she sat on a bench, waiting for the bus home, when unexpectedly, her senior Kojuro mistook her for Misaki and approached her, offering to exchange contact information. In the 25 years since high school graduation, Nobuko and Misaki each got married, while Kyojuro became a writer. Nobuko was quite surprised by his profession, but a hint of disappointment flashed in Kyojuro's eyes as he asked her, "Don't you remember the novel he wrote?" But how could Nobuko know? After Kyojuro got together with her sister, she had reduced her interactions with the two of them. Nobuko asked Kyojuro for the name of that book, but Kyojuro was unwilling to tell her, insisting instead on inviting her for a drink to reminisce about old friendships. Fearing that saying too much might lead to trouble, Nobuko seized the opportunity when the bus arrived to turn and leave. As soon as she sat down, her phone screen received a message from Kyojuro. The message read, "It was a pleasure to reunite today. If there are suitable opportunities in the future, I hope we can keep in touch." And he has always loved Misaki. Although Nobuko knew that Kyojuro's feelings were all for her sister, looking at these heartfelt words still left her emotions in turmoil. After returning home, Nobuko casually tossed her phone on the table and went to take a bath. Unexpectedly, the confession message from Kyojuro was seen by her husband Sujiro as he passed by. Sujiro, unable to contain his anger, threw the phone straight into the fish tank. Although Nobuko repeatedly explained that it was just a misunderstanding, the phone was already damaged by the water. She worried that Kyojuro might send another message and not receive a reply, feeling disheartened, so she took out paper and pen to inform him about the phone damage in the form of a letter. After receiving the letter, Kyojuro looked at the name Misaki at the end and suddenly felt that his abrupt actions last night were truly inappropriate. Misaki was the only person Kyojuro had ever loved in his life, and even when they parted ways years ago, he never stopped thinking about her. So, the moment Nobuko appeared, Kyojuro recognized her, but he was unwilling to break through that thin layer of pretense. However, The letter did not specify the sender's address. Nobuko was unwilling to reveal her residence and had already decided not to have too much involvement with Kyojiro anymore. But not long after, her husband Sujiro brought home 2 large dogs for work reasons, and the responsibility of taking care of the dogs naturally fell on Nobuko's shoulders. These 2 large dogs were almost as tall as a person at the waist, and just taking them out for walks every day left Nobuko utterly exhausted. She didn't know when it started, but she couldn't help but write about the trivialities of her days spent with the dogs in a letter to Kyojiro. As for the previous thoughts of no longer corresponding, they had long been cast aside. Nobuko gradually fell in love with the feeling of communicating through letters, not needing to reply as hastily as with text messages, nor having to carefully choose her words. She could sit at her desk, thoughtfully composing her writing, putting down the fragments of fatigue and occasional warmth from her life, all onto the paper. The sensation of her fingertips gliding over the paper felt particularly reassuring. But it was indeed difficult for one person to take care of 2 large dogs, so Nobuko had to send one of them to her hometown, entrusting it to her daughter Sakura and Nisayumi for care. During this trip back home, she also took the opportunity to visit the old site of her high school. Strolling through the familiar playground and campus, many past memories suddenly flooded her mind. So after returning home, Nobuko picked up her pen again to write a letter to Kyojiro. Meanwhile, Kyojiro found the classmate directory from back then and, after locating the addresses of the Misaki sisters, immediately decided to write a reply. However, he did not expect that the person receiving this letter would not be Nobuko, but Misaki's daughter Ayumi. Looking at the name Kyojiro on the envelope, Ayumi suddenly remembered a book at home. After opening the letter, Ayumi glimpsed the long-buried past between Kyojiro and her mother through the words. The letter stated that Kyojiro transferred to this high school in June of his senior year, with less than a year until graduation. At that time, he thought this hurried school life was just a small episode in the journey of life. But little did he know that the people he would meet and the events that would happen afterward would become unforgettable marks in his life. In the days after he transferred schools, Kyojiro always felt out of place in his surroundings until he joined the biology club and met his junior, Nobuko. Nobuko was cheerful and open-minded, always taking the initiative to talk to him, teaching him about various plant specimens and helping him catch up on missed class notes. As time passed, the two became good friends. Kyojiro first became curious about Misaki during a school assembly. That day, Misaki, as the student council president, took the stage to speak, but due to having the flu, she wore a mask the entire time, revealing only her bright and captivating eyes. From across the noisy crowd, Kyojiro watched her speak calmly, and suddenly felt an unusual flutter in his heart. What did she look like beneath the mask? This curiosity grew wildly in his heart like a vine, unnoticed even by himself. When he chatted with Nobuko, the topic would unconsciously drift to Misaki. Nobuko, sensing Kyojiro's feelings, directly took him back to her home and showed him her sister's photos. However, the images in the photos ultimately lacked reality. Kyojiro only looked at a few and then stood up to leave. Unexpectedly, just as he reached the door, he ran into Misaki, who was returning home from school. This was Kyojiro and Misaki's first real encounter. Before he could react, Nobuko quickly stepped forward and removed Misaki's mask. The moment Kyojiro saw Misaki's face, he couldn't help but hold his breath, his heart skipping a beat. He had already developed feelings for this girl he had never met before. Kyojiro's flustered state naturally did not escape Nobuko's notice. After her sister walked away, Nobuko smiled and suggested to him, since he liked her so much, why not write her a love letter to confess? Thus, from that day on, Kyojiro began writing love letters to Misaki. From the noisy cicadas outside the summer window to the falling leaves on autumn branches, from the anxious pressure of exam preparation to the confusion and longing for the future. He poured all his fragmented thoughts into the letters, one after another, never stopping. And these letters were all handed over to Nobuko to be delivered to Misaki. As for the memories of the past, Kyojiro decided to pause his writing here. Ayumi held the thick stack of letters in her hands, gently rubbing the yellowed pages with her fingers, her heart filled with anticipation. What kind of story would Kyojiro write in the next letter? So she turned to her grandmother for some letter paper, took up her pen, and wrote a reply to Kyojiro, encouraging him to keep writing and share more stories about his mother. Meanwhile, on the other side, Nobuko saw her mother Akiko walking into a house with a strange man while walking the dog. She thought her mother had found a twilight romance and couldn't help but follow to find out more. But the next second, the urgent sound of an ambulance siren rang out, and medical personnel lifted her mother onto the vehicle. Akiko had accidentally sprained her back. After being discharged, Akiko rested quietly at home. One day, she wrote a letter and asked Nobuko to deliver it to that man's house. When Nobuko received the letter, she didn't ask much and thought to herself, this is probably a concern that the elders have kept hidden in their twilight years, and it should be left to the two of them to discuss in detail. However, several days passed without any news from her mother. and the letter hung over Nobuko's heart like a stone. Unable to rest easy, she decided to take matters into her own hands and found the man's house using the address on the envelope. The person who came to open the door was the man who had accompanied her mother Akiko that day, Shozo. Seeing Nobuko, Shozo quickly explained that he had accidentally broken his right hand while taking Akiko to the hospital last time, which delayed his response. He welcomed Nobuko into his home and said that her visit was timely, hoping she could help correct Akiko's English essay. Upon hearing this, Nobuko suddenly understood. She had mistakenly misjudged her mother's relationship with Shozo. Shozo told Nobuko that Akiko had gone to the city to attend a class reunion, and as a former English teacher, he was also invited. During the gathering, everyone urged him to give another English lesson, and he agreed with a smile, while Akiko was the only one who genuinely remembered this and took the initiative to write to him for English advice. Shozo, seeing her eagerness to learn, intended to teach her well, but unfortunately, he ended up breaking his right hand, which delayed things until now. In the days that followed, Nobuko became the messenger between her mother Akiko and Shozo. Akiko's completed English essays, the corrected letters from Shozo, and the occasional small reminders tucked inside the letters, such as, "It's getting colder, remember to dress warmly," were all personally delivered by Nobuko. Those ink-scented papers felt more serious than the cold phone screens, making the teacher-student relationship that spanned years even warmer and more touching through their exchanges. Meanwhile, Ayumi and Sakura finally received a reply from Kyojiro. As Ayumi opened the letter, she clearly felt that the words Kyojiro had written to her mother years ago now carried a few more indescribable intimacies than before. The letter read, "Dear Miss Misaki, first love is truly a wonderful feeling. It seems to possess a powerful gravity, making his world revolve around Misaki, day and night. Kyojiro's mind is filled with the image of Misaki." Reading these passionate words, Ayumi's eyes suddenly tightened. It turned out that in her mother's youth, she too had experienced such pure and sincere love. It turned out that her mother had once been loved so fervently. On the other side, Nobuko, after helping Shozo correct her mother's essays one by one, would often take a moment to sit quietly in a corner of the desk in the tranquil atmosphere of the house, then take out some stationery and write a letter to Kyojiro. Unknowingly, she had written a whole stack of letters. However, Nobuko had never dared to write down her home address, partly fearing that her husband Sujiro would notice, and partly worrying that communicating with Kyojiro under her sister's name would ultimately be a fire that couldn't be contained. But she was truly eager to receive a reply from Kyojiro, so this time, she wrote the Shozo family's address on the envelope. Unexpectedly, not long after the letter was sent, Kyojiro actually found his way to their home following the address. When Nobuko saw the person standing outside the door, she was so shocked that she immediately closed the door. At that moment, she had no makeup on and was dressed plainly. Such a hurried and disheveled appearance should not be seen by Kyojiro. Nobuko hurriedly tidied herself up in front of the mirror, and after confirming that everything was in order, she slowly opened the door and welcomed Kyojiro inside. She broke the silence first and asked about the book Kyojiro mentioned that day, what its name was. Kyojiro told her that the book was called Misaki. It turned out that after he and Misaki fell in love in college, he wrote a novel about their romance, and this book won him literary awards. But since then, Kyojiro had been unable to produce any decent works. He could never escape the shadow of breaking up with Misaki. His longing for her lingered in his heart at all times, making it impossible for him to focus on creating. It is lamentable to say that after decades of writing in the literary world, he ended up with only Misaki as a book worth presenting. At this point, Kyojiro no longer concealed his feelings and frankly admitted that he had recognized her from the very beginning. He had come to ask Nobuko where the real Misaki was now. Initially, Nobuko planned to use the family's external explanation, saying that her sister had passed away due to illness. But looking at the uncontainable hope and anxiety in Kyojiro's eyes, she suddenly felt that lying to this person who had cherished her sister for decades was too cruel. So Nobuko took a deep breath and confessed everything to him. After my sister went to university, their relationship gradually became distant. Later, when I heard from her again, it was that she had eloped with a man named Yoichi and married him in a flash. Except for my sister herself, the whole family knew nothing about this Yoichi's background, only that he was idle and did not hold a job. Yoichi lived off the money my sister earned from her job, but often resorted to violence against her. However, my sister has always been stubborn and was never one to confide her troubles to others. All her grievances and pain were silently borne by her alone. Until one day, her daughter, Ayumi, who is my sister's only child, came home crying with half of her face swollen, asking for help, saying that her father was beating her mother again. At that time, I naively thought it was just a common quarrel between a couple. But when Nobuko hurried to her sister's house and saw her sister's appearance, she was immediately stunned. In my memory, my sister was radiant, the president of the student council at school, a dazzling presence that could be spotted in a crowd. But on that day, she looked pale, her eyes hollow and lifeless, so haggard that I could hardly recognize her. When Yoichi saw Nobuko had arrived, he simply said he was going out to buy some tea leaves and turned to leave, disappearing without a trace. And to this day, no one knows where he is. After Yoichi left, my sister's mental state completely collapsed. She attempted to end her life several times, and her family had to keep a close watch on her, pulling her back from the brink time and again. But eventually, one afternoon, her family failed to take care of her, and my sister left this world forever. My sister's life was completely ruined by that man. Even today, thinking of this matter, Nobuko still feels a deep sense of regret. If the person who married my sister back then had been Kyojiro, her later life surely wouldn't have been so tragic. Compared to the innocent feelings she had for Kyojiro in her youth, Nobuko's heart is now filled with nostalgia and regret for her sister. Although she doesn't know much about the world of writers, she sincerely hopes that Kyojiro can create more works related to her sister. Because when Nobuko first picked up the pen to write a letter, she merely wanted to have more interactions with Kyojiro under her sister's name. But gradually, she developed an illusion as if her sister had never left during the writing process. Perhaps, as long as someone remembers, as long as someone continues to write her story, even if she has passed away, she will forever live in everyone's hearts. Nobuko said she had always wanted to read that book, Misaki, but unfortunately, it has long been out of print. Upon hearing this, Kyojiro took a book from his backpack and handed it to her. He had always carried a copy with him. After Nobuko took the book, she looked up and smiled as she said goodbye to Kyojiro. Kyojiro then boarded the bus, heading to the residence where Misaki had lived after their marriage. He harbored a faint hope in his heart, wishing to find traces related to Yoichi there. Kyojiro recalled the girl he once held in his palm, cherished like a treasure, who now seemed to have become a maid that could be looked down upon in Yoichi's eyes, and anger surged within him. He made a silent resolution to find Yoichi and seek justice for Misaki. He remembered Nobuko's surprised expression when she heard he was a writer and couldn't help but sigh. It turned out that 25 years could fade many people's memories. The reason he wrote Misaki was all because of a suggestion from Nobuko during high school. Back then, after Kyojiro handed another love letter to Nobuko, she smiled and suggested that since he was so talented, he might as well write a book about his feelings for his sister, which would surely touch many people. Kyojiro found this plan very feasible and began to conceive the framework of the entire book. The reason he wrote so many love letters was also to understand how Misaki felt when she read those words. So one day after school, Kyojiro mustered his courage and approached Misaki, asking her what she thought after reading those love letters. Seeing the puzzled look in Misaki's eyes, Kyojiro immediately realized Nobuko had never given those love letters to Misaki at all. The next day at school, Kyojiro found Nobuko and questioned her about why she had withheld those letters. Nobuko was left speechless by his questioning and had to confess that she was worried her sister would be distracted and it would affect her studies. On that day, Nobuko also wrote a love letter herself and carefully handed it to Kyojiro. The letter stated that she had long harbored feelings for Kyojiro, but Kyojiro's heart had always belonged only to Misaki. He gently shook his head, rejecting her feelings, as he faced Nobuko's expectant and anxious gaze. Just then, the bus stop announcement sounded, and Kyojiro's thoughts came to an abrupt halt. After getting off the bus, he followed the address in his memory, and the door was opened by a stranger who was pregnant. The woman told him that this was Yoichi's home, and she was Yoichi's current wife, Miho. Upon hearing that he was looking for Yoichi, Miho sent a message to Yoichi on his behalf. In the gap, while waiting for a reply, when Miki learned that Kyojiro was the writer Kyojiro, her eyes instantly lit up, and she immediately got up to fetch a book from the study. It was the very book, Misaki. She asked Kyojiro if she was fortunate enough to receive his signature. Unlike Yoichi's cruelty, Miki was a gentle and kind woman. Kyojiro couldn't bear to refuse, so he patiently nodded. However, when Kyojiro saw Yoichi in the tavern, he frowned. Upon seeing him, Yoichi immediately displayed a provocative and smug expression and began to mock Kyojiro coldly. When Kyojiro mentioned Misaki's passing, there was no trace of guilt on Yoichi's face. Instead, he disdainfully said, "That woman was very stubborn, crying all day long, truly annoying. Even that daughter Ayumi is equally unpleasant, with her clear and pure eyes, making him feel uncomfortable, as if she was mocking his filth, cowardice, and incompetence." Yoichi had once wanted to make a name for himself, but the unpredictability of life left him ultimately achieving nothing. It turned out that Yoichi's entire life was spent in self-indulgence, accomplishing nothing. He poured all his powerlessness and resentment towards life onto Misaki and Ayumi, directing all his violence and harm towards this innocent mother and daughter. Looking at the face of Yoichi, filled with resentment and numbness, Kyojiro suddenly froze. He had once eagerly pursued Yoichi's whereabouts, determined to seek justice for Misaki. However, at this moment, he truly realized that the person before him had already completely sunk, with no room for redemption. No amount of questioning and anger was more than a boring farce to him. Spending even a moment with such a person was a waste of time. Kyojiro said nothing more and stood up, walking straight out of the tavern. Miki had already been waiting outside the tavern for a long time. When she saw him come out, she hurriedly stepped forward to hand him paper and pen, earnestly requesting his signature as a keepsake. Since hitting a bottleneck in his writing, Kyojiro had not received such enthusiastic support from readers for many years. He felt pleasantly surprised, took the paper and pen, and wrote down his name. Looking at the wet ink on the title page, a complex emotion surged in Kyojiro's heart, both a sense of melancholy for Misaki's troubled life and pride in being remembered by readers after a long separation. It turned out that his words had once been so earnestly cherished. After leaving Miki's home, Kyojiro decided to revisit the old high school site before returning to Kyoto. That place, which held all his youthful secrets, was the most precious memory of his life. The bus slowly drove into the familiar street. After Kyojiro got off, he walked slowly towards the high school he hadn't visited in many years. He raised his camera, his fingertips trembling slightly, and aimed the lens at the path he had walked countless times before. He still remembered that every spring, the trees on both sides of the path were lush and green. He often waited here for Nobuko to go to the biology club together, but now, returning to the old place, everything had changed. The classmates and friends from back then had long since gone their separate ways, and the youthful hustle and bustle was no more. He walked along the path to the teaching building, pushed open the slightly ajar wooden door, and dust flew towards him. Kyojiro easily found the classroom from back then, only to see the door hanging askew on its hinges, with the desks and chairs inside in disarray, covered in a thick layer of dust. The blackboard still bore half-faded chalk marks, like formulas the teacher had never finished writing, or perhaps doodles left by someone. Yet the images in his memory were as clear as if they had happened yesterday. He had quietly written love letters to Misaki in this classroom, the sound of the pen scratching against the paper mixed with the cicadas outside, becoming the most unforgettable background sound of his youth. Kyojiro stood in the empty classroom, gazing at the desolate scene, unable to suppress a sigh. Time is merciless, indeed, and does not spare the old. Those vibrant youthful days had ultimately become dusty memories of the past. Just as he was lost in thought about the crooked desks and chairs, a burst of cheerful laughter suddenly came from outside the window. Kyojiro turned to look and saw two girls walking side by side on the path, holding a dog. The familiar figures and expressions made Kyojiro's eyes widen in surprise. These girls looked so much like Misaki and Nobuko from back then. Kyojiro hurriedly ran out of the school gate and quickly approached the two girls. And the two girls recognized him as well. Ayumi spoke first, her tone filled with apology. "You must be Mr. Kyojiro, right? I'm sorry for using my mother's name to write to you all this time." Ayumi introduced herself first, then introduced her cousin Sakura, who is Nobuko's daughter. Through their correspondence over this time, Ayumi already knew of Kyojiro's deep feelings for her mother. She invited Kyojiro to her home to light a stick of incense for her mother. As Kyojiro pushed open the door to the house and looked around at the furnishings, he found that everything here was just as he remembered. Beside him, Ayumi quietly told him about her mother's experiences. "After my mother passed away, my grandmother and the others publicly claimed that she died of illness. They believed that my mother chose to end her life because she could no longer endure my father's domestic violence, and that was an undignified thing. Ayumi does not think so. Her mother has never done anything wrong, and she deserves to be treated well. The people she loved, the pain she endured, the tears that fell silently at night, and all her expectations for life. These stories and experiences deserve to be known by everyone." Ayumi left space for Kyojiro to be alone with her mother. Kyojiro sat before the spirit tablet, reaching out to touch Misaki's portrait in the frame. The cold sensation made his throat choke up, and his nose felt unbearably sour. After 25 years of separation, to reunite in such a way is truly cruel. Looking at Misaki's bright smile in the portrait, Kyojiro's thoughts drifted back to those dreamlike high school days. At that time, Misaki was deeply impressed by his eloquent writing after reading the love letters he had written. Later, when Misaki was elected as the student representative for the graduation ceremony, she asked Kyojiro to help her revise her speech. Kyojiro made only slight sketches and modifications, and the originally somewhat stiff speech instantly gained warmth. The words about youth and the future were polished by him to be both sincere and clear. Misaki held the revised manuscript, reading it repeatedly, her eyes filled with uncontainable amazement and joy. Kyojiro often thought how wonderful it would be if time could forever stand still at that moment. At that time, they were full of infinite longing for the future, and they stood side by side, having not yet experienced the later separations and pains. After a long time, Kyojiro finally pulled himself out of his memories. He reached for the letter Misaki left for Ayumi beside the spirit tablet, saw that it was still unopened, and gently placed it back. Just then, his gaze fell on the bookshelf. There was actually a book titled Misaki. Seeing this, Ayumi said to Kyojiro, "She also read this book, so when she received your letter, Ayumi immediately recognized Kyojiro's name. However, before seeing this published book, Ayumi first saw a manuscript. She turned around and took out a wooden box from the room, which contained all the love letters Kyojiro had written to Misaki back then, along with several letters. Ayumi told Kyojiro that her mother had always regarded these letters as treasures. Every time Kyojiro wrote a page of love letters, he would copy them and send them to her mother because he said these were his exclusive love letters to Misaki, and he hoped Misaki would be the first to read these words. Seeing the tears glistening in Kyojiro's eyes, Ayumi couldn't help but choke up and say, "These letters, these manuscripts, and this book are all treasures that mother cherished the most. She herself has read them many times. In the most difficult times for her mother, Ayumi always held on to a glimmer of hope, wishing that one day, a person who deeply loved her mother would appear and rescue them from the flames and water. It was with this thought that Ayumi, while being beaten by her father, in pain and moaning, and while crying all night with a heart full of despair, never gave up hope, allowing her to stand tall and move forward. How she wished Kyojiro would appear a little earlier, just a bit sooner. But it's okay, Kyojiro eventually came. If her mother knew from the afterlife, she would surely be very happy." Listening to Ayumi's words, Kyojiro suddenly felt that the gloom that had long occupied his heart had dissipated somewhat. He had never thought that the youthful words he had written back then contained such heavy power, becoming a beam of light that supported Ayumi through her darkest moments. Kyojiro suddenly wanted to pick up his pen again. It turned out that keeping Misaki's memories hidden in his heart was not a bad thing at all. Those words that he never had the chance to express, those past events sealed by time, were not shackles binding him. As Nobuko said, as long as a person is deeply remembered in the heart, they will never truly disappear. What he could do was to put this memory into writing, to continue writing about the light that supported Ayumi and her mother through the darkness. Not to make up for regrets, but simply to preserve that gentle light belonging to Misaki that once illuminated the darkest moments. The day after Kyojiro left, Sakura also packed her bags and prepared to return to her home in the city. In fact, she should have returned earlier, but she couldn't bear to leave Ayumi, so she delayed her departure. On one hand, she wanted to accompany Ayumi for a few more days to help her out of the shadow of pain. On the other hand, she was also caught up in a naive feeling of infatuation. Her classmate, a boy, made her realize that she seemed to have feelings for him. This unfamiliar emotion left her at a loss, and she could only choose to temporarily avoid it. But Ayumi's words yesterday, "We must hold on to hope and face it bravely," deeply touched her heart. She thought, perhaps she should also be a bit braver and face this naive feeling. Before leaving, Kyojiro made a photo album of the pictures taken during this trip home and gifted it to Nobuko. He did not hide the fact that he had seen Ayumi and Sakura. He said that this trip home had rekindled his courage to create. After seeing Kyojiro off, Ayumi finally gathered the courage to open the letter her mother had left behind. But when she unfolded the letter, she was surprised to find that it was not a farewell message, but the graduation speech that Kyojiro had helped her mother revise back in the day.